So this is going to be the most important tutorial. So everyone needs to do this, follow these steps, okay? In order for you to navigate in VR, you need to add a few very important elements to your scene. One, things that you want to be able to teleport onto or to move onto in VR needs to have a collision, right? I'm working with a landscape, and landscapes inherently have a collision. If you're using a Datasmith import and it doesn't have a collision, I'm not going to be able to teleport onto any of those surfaces. So you either have to add collisions to those elements or those objects, right? Or you can be very sort of deliberate about your collisions by adding cubes, let's say in Unreal Engine, and utilizing that as your navigable surface, right? As your collider for your surfaces. The other thing, as you can see on my upper left-hand corner here, is it says lighting needs to be rebuilt. Try to avoid having this in your scene, because if you have many, many objects with unbuilt lighting, you're taxing your graphics card and it's going to run, your scene's not going to run as smoothly. So all you need to do is go in and build lighting before you package your projects. And the last thing we'll talk about is packaging your projects. Your projects need to be packaged for VR, okay? First and foremost, in 4.27, if I go into my project settings, under maps and modes, I want to make sure my editor startup map and my game default map are the levels that I'm working in. If you're working on, let's say, the 4.26 VR template, this might say motion controller map or startup map or something like that. You need to find the project that you're working on and make these two, put the level that you're working on in these two slots. Okay. In 4.27, you'll see that there is a specific VR game mode, and the default pawn class should be set to VR pawn if you started with the VR template, right? Make sure that these are in VR game mode or VR pawn. If you're using 4.26, it might say game mode base, in which case you'll have to follow a different step, and I'll show you what that is, okay? So with that said, I have a player start in my scene, and that player start is going to work with whatever game mode that I'm using, and it's going to spawn whatever pawn is my default pawn, right? So that works if I have a VR game mode. If I don't have a VR game mode, I can get rid of my player start. I can go into my VR template, find my blueprints, and find my VR pawn, and I can drag my VR pawn into my scene. I can rotate my VR pawn to look in whatever direction I want that VR pawn to look. And this could be the pawn that I possess when I start my game, but I need to do one critical thing, which is to auto possess this pawn with player 0, right? So I need to check this box. Otherwise, it's going to spawn whatever default pawn into probably the 0, 0 position of your world, okay? So I added my VR pawn and I'm possessing player 0, right? So now when I hit play, I'm going to be in that location where I added that pawn. It seems to be off a little bit, but I'll look into why it's not in the right spot. But even when I hit play here, you could see that there's this lighting needs to be rebuilt in the top. Just don't have that in your scene. Just build lighting. You're doing yourself a huge favor doing that. And so please, please follow that step. Okay? So in order for me to navigate in VR, right, I'm going to hit play and put on my headset. And I'm going to hopefully be able to track my motion controllers, right? I can tap on the top of my thumb pad and it's not really doing anything, right? I have no surfaces to navigate onto because there is no navigation. And the way I get navigation is to add a nav mesh bound volume. So under volumes, I'm going to look for a nav mesh bounds volume, and I'm going to drag that into my scene. But just so you're aware that there is under the show button on your viewport, this navigation checkbox, or I can hit the key, the keyboard button P to visualize it, right? And I should then be able to see green surfaces that represent every place I can navigate onto. Right now, there's nothing green because I have no nav mesh bounds volume. So let's drag one into the scene. And now this volume, whatever it intersects with that has a collision, will start to show green. This is where I can navigate to. I can't navigate anywhere else. And so let's move this around. And then, I don't know why it's not turning green. Let's try hitting P again. So it should be visible. It's not working. So let's see if we can build our navigation. Or let's just hit the build button. So in this case, I'm not building lighting, I'm building everything. Maybe the box is too small. So the nav mesh bounds volume starts off at 200 by 200. And so if we want to increase the size of our navigable surface, for whatever reason, this box was too small and wasn't calculating where I could or could not navigate. Oh, you know what? I know why, because I have some random cube. Um, that I added. That's why it wasn't showing up. So basically what I need to do is select my nav mesh bounds volume, and I can resize this thing to cover the area that I want to be able to walk around in, right? This is also a really good way of limiting where the player can and cannot walk. So I'm going to adjust the brush settings X, Y, and Z to cover the area in which I want to be able to navigate, right? So now if I hit P here, I'm going to cancel my light build just because it's going to take too long to do. And then I'm going to try to play in VR again. I'm going to put my headset back on and let's see if I can navigate. I don't know why there's... If I tap on this top screen, I should really be able to get like a navigation, teleportation stream. And as you can see, I'm having trouble getting this to work, which great increases the chances that you'll have a lot of trouble getting that to work, right? So for whatever reason in 4.27, rather than using a VR pawn like this, so if you're using 4.26, add the VR pawn, set the auto possess to player 0. In 4.27, what you're going to want to do is add a player start instead. Lower the player start so the center of the player start penetrates the, is sort of in the middle of the surface that you want to navigate to, right? Because this represents the floor in VR. And you can rotate this so the arrow is pointing to where you want the player to be seeing or to be looking. And now when I hit play, it's going to spawn my VR pawn. I'm going to put on my headset. I've got my hand controllers. Now my teleportation appears, right? And you can see that little ring represents where I'll end up when I let go of my thumb, right? So I can teleport around, but I can only teleport onto surfaces that have a collision, right? So this object has no collision, so it's not going to let me interact with it, right? And I can only go so far, right? Now, like I'm only interacting with my landscape, right? So if I want to be able to climb up these stairs, I need to add a collider that's going to interact with my nav mesh volume in order for me to climb those stairs. So let's do that next. I want to be able to climb these stairs. And so how do we do that, right? So one, players start, just to recap, players start, right, in maps and modes, under project settings, maps and modes, right? I need to have a VR game mode, and my default pawn has to be the VR pawn, okay? Option 2, this is 4.27. Option 2, if you're using 4.26, drag your VR pawn into the scene, and in the details panel, you can scroll down to, or just do a search for possess, and set the auto possess player 0, right? So then you'll possess this VR pawn when you hit play, okay? Those are two key steps that you need to complete, right? But there's more. You need a nav mesh bounds volume that's going to define the area in which Unreal Engine is going to calculate a navigation surface, right? And I can visualize that by hitting P. So anything that's green, I can actually interact with and potentially step onto, climb onto, okay? And if we go to my architecture here and I hit P, you can see that my stair is not navigable. So what I need to do is add something that has a collision, like a cube, for instance, and I can start to borrow the collider or the collision of the cube in order to generate my own navigable surface, right? And so I'm going to rotate this, move this up, and rotate this at an angle that's going to kind of work to be my stairs, right? And I want to align this so that I can create this navigable surface, right? So I'm not actually interacting with the stairs that are in my scene. I'm actually interacting with the cube, right? Visually, it's going to look and feel like I'm on the stairs, but in reality, Unreal Engine is only using objects that have collisions in order to work. But I don't want to be able to see this cube, right? I just want to interact with it. So what I'm going to do is go down to my rendering and make this, and both of these steps is very important. Step 1, make it invisible so I don't visually see it while I'm working, right? But even more important, this needs to be actor hidden in game, okay? If it's visible, if it's invisible but it's not hidden in game, when I hit play, that thing is going to be visible, okay? This visibility, it's almost useless. It's there just to affect the editor. So if I want it make it hidden in the editor while I'm working. That's what that checkbox is for. What's more important is that this actor is hidden in game. So now when I hit play, I'm going to pop my headset back on. I'm going to grab my controllers. And I'm going to start teleporting now. Right? I can teleport right through this thing because there's nothing preventing me from doing that because there's no collider. Right? Now I can walk up towards the step, and you could see that now I can climb my stair because my teleportation is interacting with not the stair itself, but that cube that I created. Okay? And so you need to add either collisions or objects that already have collisions built into it so that I can interact with it in VR. Okay. And then the last thing that would be of help for you is I actually don't want to be able to navigate into certain areas of my map, right? So there are two ways of doing that. One is don't have any navigate, like don't have the nav mesh bounds volume intersect with those areas. Or you could add a nav modifier volume. And so now if I hit P again, you can see I can effectively create an area that will sort of negate my nav mesh bounds volume, right? And it works exactly the same way as the nav mesh bounds volume, except it just has the opposite effect, right? So I can add this cube around my bunker thing here that's going to prevent a player from navigating into it, right? And so I'm just going to align this, right? So now we can see that my nav mesh, which is represented by the green, has a big hole in it, right? But make sure you're only covering what you don't want navigable, because I might want someone to be able to walk on that sidewalk area. And so I'm going to adjust that volume accordingly, right? But if this thing doesn't penetrate that navigable surface, you can see it's still building the navigation below it. So make sure that the volume is penetrating whatever collidable collision object or collidable surface you have going, so that now when I hit play, I'm going to pop my headset back on again, grab my hand controllers. Now I can see my hand controllers. And now you can see that I cannot navigate into this volume, right? It just stops right at the edge of that, right? So again, very important. You could see my street is not what I'm navigating onto, but the landscape beneath it. And so what I might want to do is add some cubes or add something that's going to make this street surface navigable, which is adding a collision object to that or beneath that, or turning this into a collision object itself, right? So I can start adding cubes underneath this street, right? But this street has like this subtle curvature. So maybe the cube doesn't work as well. So another way of adding a collision, depending on the complexity of your asset, is to I'm going to right click on the road asset, which I have highlighted, and browse to it. I can open up the asset itself by double clicking on it. And what I can do here is under collision complexity, I'm going to use complex collision as simple, right? And you could see that there's no collision to remove because there is no collision. What I need to do is add a collision object. Before I do that, actually, let's just see if it did anything, right? And in fact, I think it may have, just by switching that, I think I may already be able to navigate onto it. So just by changing the collision complexity, make um, complex collisions simple, I believe I've now, yeah, given myself the ability to interact and navigate onto this street surface, right? And so now I am not on the landscape, right? Here I am on the landscape, but here I should be popping onto my street, okay? So that's the other way in which I could do that, right? So I can keep climbing, but now, you know, I've basically teleported back down to the landscape because that's the nearest collision object that's uh, that my teleportation mechanic was interacting with. Okay, again, so now there's no collision on the sidewalk, so I'm gonna have to add some kind of a collision object to the sidewalk, like a cube, and make it invisible, or I can browse to this asset and turn the geometry of this asset into a collider. Okay, and so you might be asking, well, why don't you just turn everything into a collision object? Well, the problem is you're doubling up the geometry, and so if you have a very complex or a dense mesh and you turn that also into a collision object, it's very taxing. And so it's better to have simplified collisions. But long story short, you need a collision one way or the other. So use whichever technique or method makes the most sense for your project, okay, or for the particular asset that you're dealing with, okay? So 3 things to consider: nav mesh bounds volume, right? Nav mesh modifier volume, right? Adding collision objects like cubes and other Unreal assets that come with built-in collisions, and then making them hidden in the game, right? So we don't see them, right? Or going to, so this road object is a datasmith object, going in and changing its collision complexity, right? And setting it to use complex collision as simple will give me the ability, or give Unreal Engine the ability for its nav mesh bounds volume to interact with those surfaces and create the nav mesh, which is visualized in green and can be toggled on and off with the letter P on the keyboard. Okay, so make sure, if you haven't already tested, and I know everyone waits to test these things, it's a huge mistake. So everyone should test this thing as soon as possible to make sure that their scenes run in VR, right? And make sure you're including all of these elements in your scene. And then you can package your projects and test it out. But first and foremost, build your lighting, okay? I don't want to see this red light build warning on your projects. It's going to drive me crazy, okay? And it's going to make your scene perform less well. All right? Okay, so that's it. Please make sure you follow those steps. Next video will be on packaging your projects, which is going to be fairly straightforward, but package and test often, like constantly, right? Because the last thing you want to do is spend all this time on these projects, pop on the headset, and it not work. Okay, that's the worst case scenario. So please test frequently, please package often, and load it up in room 706 and make sure it works. There should at least be one version that works in VR, if not the latest, right? A version that works in VR on those laptops so we can experience what your scene looks and feels like in VR. Okay?